The cameras were still adjusting their focus when Jasmine Crockett felt it, a heat in the room that wasn't just from the studio lights. It was the kind of heat that came when powerful people knew their grip was slipping. She could see it in the way Donald Trump perched forward in his chair, his hands clasped like he was about to lecture the world. She could feel it in the hush that fell across the audience, every pair of eyes flicking between her and Traoré, waiting to see if these two would turn on each other. But that wasn't going to happen. Not today. The moderator's voice was a taut wire. We're here to discuss America's global influence and its role in Africa. Trump cut in before the sentence was even finished, his tone dripping with a smugness Jasmine had heard too many times. Let's be honest. Without American aid, half these countries would collapse overnight. A ripple of discomfort ran through the rows of journalists. Jasmine didn't blink. She'd expected this. She had come prepared. Traoré tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth, like a man who'd waited years to hear that arrogance said out loud. And without Africa, he said, his French accented English precise, you wouldn't have the wealth you brag about. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even Trump looked briefly startled, as though he hadn't anticipated Traoré would be this direct, this unafraid. Jasmine could have let the moment settle. She could have waited for the moderator to regain control. But she didn't. She leaned in, her voice low and calm, and met Trump's stare head-on. Your empire, she said, each syllable deliberate, was built on exploitation, of labor, of land, of people. And you can't stand the thought that the world sees it now. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but the words stalled as the audience erupted into a murmur, a sound somewhere between shock and recognition. Traoré's gaze locked with Jasmine's for a fleeting second. There was no rivalry in it. Just a shared understanding. They had found common cause in exposing the lie that America's power was benevolence in disguise. The moderator tried to interrupt. Congresswoman Crockett, let's keep this civil. No, Jasmine said, her tone unshakable. Let's keep this honest. She could feel the camera lenses tightening in, recording every breath. This was the moment that would play on every news loop, every timeline. The moment the empire cracked in public view. And she wasn't about to look away. Trump recovered quickly, he always did. His face hardened into that practiced scowl, the one he'd used to bulldoze reporters and opponents alike. You know what's funny, he said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. People like you two love to talk about America's so-called crimes, but you never talk about what we've built. About how much better the world is because of us. Jasmine felt the heat climb up her neck. She didn't interrupt. Not yet. She wanted him to say it all, to dig his own rhetorical grave while millions watched. Traoré folded his hands neatly in front of him. Better for who? He asked quietly. Trump's jaw twitched. Better for everyone. For every nation that needed help. Help? Jasmine's voice sliced clean across his sentence, her eyes steady as iron. You call it help when your corporations strip resources, when your military props up dictators, when your policies leave families in the dust? A hush fell over the studio. Someone coughed near the back, as if trying to dispel the tension but only making it sharper. Trump leaned forward, jabbing a finger in Jasmine's direction. You'd rather side with a man who doesn't even believe in democracy. Because he's seen what your version of democracy really means, she fired back, her tone crackling with a cold fury. You pretend it's freedom, but it's control. You pretend it's generosity, but it's profit. Traoré didn't smile, but his eyes shone with a grim satisfaction. I do not agree with every policy of my country, he said, addressing the room, not just Trump. But I will not sit here and pretend your country has not been the architect of suffering on a scale no African leader could ever match. The moderator looked almost panicked now, his papers fluttering in his hands. Gentlemen, Congresswoman, let's. No, Jasmine said again, her voice low but unyielding. Let's finish this. She turned fully to Trump, her shoulders squaring as if she were bracing for impact. "Your empire is crumbling," she said, the words measured and deliberate. "Because you built it on a lie, that you could take and never be held accountable. But here we are." Trump opened his mouth, only to close it again when he realized the audience was no longer with him. Jasmine felt a charge under her skin. She wasn't just speaking for herself now. She was speaking for every person who'd ever been told to sit down, to be grateful, to shut up. And she was just getting started. For a moment, nobody dared to breathe too loudly. Even the cameras seemed hesitant, their red lights blinking in a stunned rhythm. The moderator shuffled his stack of cue cards as though hoping the script might magically offer an escape route. But there was no escape. Not from this. Jasmine could see it in Trump's eyes, the sudden awareness that this wasn't going to be another performance he could dominate with slogans and smirks. She had stepped past the boundaries of his comfort, and there was no going back. Traoré rested his elbows lightly on the table, his posture deceptively calm. "You want to talk about what America built," he said, voice low enough that the room had to lean in to catch it. "You built an economy on the backs of people you still pretend to care about. You built your foreign policy on the premise that Africans, Arabs, and Asians could be manipulated, bought, or bombed as you pleased." Trump tried to cut him off, but Traoré didn't flinch. "And now," he continued, "you cannot stand the thought that we are no longer begging for your approval." A soft murmur rose from the press gallery, that collective intake of breath when someone finally says what's been festering in the shadows for decades. Jasmine turned to face the audience directly, her voice clear and unshaken. "He wants you to believe this is about hating America," she said, motioning toward Trump without even looking at him. "But it's not. It's about telling the truth. The truth that our country has done harm, and it's time we stop pretending otherwise." Trump's nostrils flared, the vein in his temple pulsing. "And you think siding with foreign leaders who oppress their own people makes you righteous?" he snapped. Jasmine's eyes narrowed just enough to let everyone know she was done letting him control the narrative. "I'm not siding with anyone," she replied. "I'm standing with the millions of people your policies have crushed, here and abroad." Traoré nodded once, as though sealing an unspoken pact. "We may not agree on everything," he said, looking at Jasmine, "but on this, we are united." The moderator attempted to interject again, but it was futile. The momentum had shifted, and no polite procedural cue could stop it. Jasmine leaned in, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal calm. "You built your empire on the assumption that no one would ever look you in the eye and call it what it is. Well," she paused, letting the silence stretch until it burned. "It's theft. It's exploitation. And it's ending." The room erupted, some in gasps, some in applause. Trump looked around, searching for a sympathetic face among the rows of cameras. But the audience wasn't with him anymore. They were listening to her. Trump's face had settled into something close to a sneer, but Jasmine recognized the flicker behind it, something he was trying to disguise as righteous indignation. Fear. Not of her, not of Traoré, but of what it looked like when the veneer cracked in front of millions of people. "You're so eager to tear this country down," he spat, voice thick with forced bravado. "But you wouldn't have your platform without the freedoms we built. You wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for the sacrifices." Jasmine didn't let him finish. "Sacrifices made by people who looked like me," she shot back, her tone steely. "Who were dragged here in chains, who worked fields they'd never own, who built your wealth while you wrote yourself into the story as a hero." A low wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The moderator's mouth opened, then closed, like he'd thought of something to say but couldn't remember how to speak. Traoré's expression was unreadable. Only the tension in his jaw betrayed how deeply he was listening. When he spoke, his words landed with the force of a hammer. "You think your history is a gift to the world," he said, his accent pronounced but precise, "but you cannot imagine the damage it did. You will never feel it the way we have. Trump slammed a hand against the table, the hollow thud echoing in the cavernous studio. "You know nothing about sacrifice," he barked, his face flushed with frustration. Jasmine didn't even blink. She leaned closer, her voice lowering until it carried an intimacy more cutting than any shout. "Oh, I know more about sacrifice than you ever will," she said. "Because sacrifice isn't something you do in a boardroom. It's watching your mother work 2 jobs and still fall behind. It's watching your neighborhood bulldoze to build highways no one there could afford to drive. It's seeing your community called violent and ungrateful when all it ever asked for was a fair chance." Trump looked like he was about to speak again, but she raised a single finger, just enough to silence him without even trying. "And you," she continued, her gaze locked on him, "you took that pain and turned it into profit. You took fear and turned it into votes. You took struggle and turned it into a punchline." Traoré shifted, his voice quiet but ironclad. "He does not care about freedom," he said, nodding toward Trump. "He only cares that his empire of illusion survives another news cycle." The room went so still that Jasmine could hear the hum of the overhead lights. She felt the weight of every eye fixed on them. Every heartbeat tuned to the same frequency of raw, electric disbelief. She didn't smile. She didn't grandstand. She simply let the truth hang there, undeniable, in the space between them. And Trump, so used to controlling the narrative, could do nothing but sit there in the silence he'd never learned how to withstand. For a few heartbeats, the room felt like it was holding its breath. You could almost hear the collective reckoning, the silent inventory of every excuse, every denial that had kept the empire intact for so long. Jasmine knew this was the moment viewers would replay 100 times, the moment the balance of power shifted without a single law being passed. Trump tried to steady himself, his hands braced on the edge of the table. "You know," he began, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle, "it's easy to criticize when you've never built anything. All you do is complain. All you do is tear down." Jasmine didn't look away. "Maybe you think that because you've never had to build anything you couldn't own," she said. "I've built community. I've built coalitions. And I've done it without exploiting the desperation of the people I claim to serve." Traoré inclined his head, his voice a low, resonant counterpoint. "This is why you fear her," he said to Trump, not bothering to hide the scorn. "Because she is what you pretend to be. Someone who earned their place without stepping on others to get there." The moderator cleared his throat, trying again to reclaim control. "Let's remember," he said, his voice quivering, "we are here to debate policies." "No," Jasmine said, her tone cool as glass. "We are here to tell the truth." She turned her gaze back to Trump, her expression unflinching. "You talk about building. But everything you built was on a foundation of fear. Fear of immigrants. Fear of black voices. Fear of anyone you couldn't control." She could feel the audience leaning closer, drawn in by something raw and undeniable. "But fear isn't leadership," she continued. "It's just a cheap substitute for courage." Trump opened his mouth, but Traoré cut across him with a finality that stilled even the moderators. "And courage," he said, "is standing in front of the most powerful man in the world and telling him he has no clothes." The words landed like a slap, so precise and unexpected that even Trump looked momentarily stunned. Jasmine didn't miss the way his jaw tightened, the way he shifted in his seat as though searching for a way to end it all with one last sound bite. But the cameras were still rolling. The audience was still watching. And Jasmine knew the narrative had already escaped his grasp. She took a breath, steadying her own heartbeat, and spoke in a voice so even it was almost soft. "Your empire is crumbling," she repeated, every syllable deliberate. Because the only thing holding it up was the belief no one would ever challenge it to its face. Trump's eyes narrowed, but he didn't reply. Because there was nothing left to say that could make the truth disappear. For a long moment, Trump didn't even try to speak. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion that crossed his face, indignation, calculation, something almost like panic. Jasmine knew he was searching for the line, the insult, the distraction that would break their momentum. But there was no line coming to save him this time. The moderator swallowed audibly. "Congresswoman Crockett, President Trump, perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No," Jasmine said without raising her voice. "If you can send drones into other people's countries without asking, you can sit here and listen to what they have to say." A shiver of recognition moved across the audience, like a gust of wind you couldn't see but felt down to the bone. Trump finally found his voice, low and cold. "You love to talk about American sins, but you never talk about what the alternative looks like. You think this man," he gestured dismissively to Traoré, "is some moral authority? He's another strongman pretending to be a revolutionary." Traoré didn't flinch. "Better to be honest about power than to pretend you never abuse it," he said evenly. "At least I do not claim to be the world's savior while draining its resources." Trump leaned forward, voice sharpening. "You think America owes you something, both of you. You think you're entitled to criticize the very system that made you possible." Jasmine's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Entitled to criticize," she repeated, her voice soft with disbelief. "It's not entitlement. It's accountability. You confuse the two because you've never had to answer to anyone." The moderator's hand hovered over the microphone switch, as if he might kill the feed just to stop the unraveling. But Jasmine could see the audience now, leaning forward, phones discreetly recording, eyes locked on her. They weren't leaving. They weren't turning away. She drew a breath, feeling her pulse steady. "You call us ungrateful," she said, her tone clear, "because we won't pretend your empire was a gift. You call us radicals because we won't celebrate a system built on extraction and inequality. But we're not radicals." Traoré spoke without hesitation, finishing her thought as if they had rehearsed it. "We are realists," he said, voice carrying across the quiet. "And reality is not your strong suit." The moderator tried once more, voice brittle. "I'm going to remind all participants." But Jasmine raised her hand gently, stopping him. "Remind us all you like," she said. "It won't change the truth." Trump sat back, his expression frozen in a rictus of disdain. But Jasmine could see the smallest shift, the acknowledgement, however reluctant, that he was no longer the center of this story. And in that silence, she realized he had already lost. The studio lights seemed harsher now, picking up every line on Trump's face, every twitch in his jaw. For a man who'd built a persona on being untouchable, the realization that he was losing the room was something he couldn't disguise. Jasmine felt the moment settle into her bones, a quiet certainty that no matter how he tried to spin this later, the damage was already done. "Let me ask you something," she said, her voice low, as if this was a conversation meant only for him. "When you talk about making America great again, great for who?" Trump's gaze snapped to hers, eyes narrowing to slits. "For everyone," he said automatically, but his voice sounded thin now. "For everyone," she repeated, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. "Tell that to the families who lost everything in the recession while you bragged about buying their homes cheap. Tell it to the communities whose schools and hospitals withered while you slashed taxes for billionaires." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "That's called business," he said, trying to reclaim his old swagger. "That's how the world works." Traoré shifted in his seat, his tone deceptively calm. "That is not business. That is plunder dressed up in a suit and tie." The moderator opened his mouth, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance to redirect. She leaned in, her voice soft but laced with iron. "The world is tired of men like you telling them that suffering is just the cost of progress." Trump tilted his chin up, grasping for the familiar script. "I've done more for this country than you ever will. And you've done more damage than you'll ever admit," Jasmine cut in, her voice steady. "You say you made America respected again, but what you really did was strip away any pretense of decency. You showed the world that when power is threatened, it will lie, cheat, and steal to keep its place. A slow exhale moved through the audience, the kind of collective realization you could almost feel against your skin. Traoré folded his hands, voice resonant. "The emperor has no clothes," he said simply. "And the world is no longer afraid to say so." Trump's mouth opened, then closed, as though he'd swallowed something bitter. He looked out over the cameras, searching for the loyal nods, the reflexive applause that always followed his tirades. But this time, the silence was deeper. Jasmine let the hush stretch, daring him to fill it. When he didn't, she spoke again, softer now, almost regretful. "You could have used your influence to build something lasting," she said. "But you chose the cheap applause over the hard work. You chose fear over truth." The moderator shifted uncomfortably, his voice little more than a whisper. "I think, we need to move on to closing remarks." Jasmine didn't look away from Trump. "No," she said. "We need to finish what we started." And in that instant, she knew they'd reached a point of no return. The moderator's voice sounded far away, like a distant echo no one cared to follow. Even the studio crew had stopped pretending they could control the current. All eyes were locked on Jasmine and Traoré, two voices who had somehow become the conscience of a moment that was bigger than any one of them. Trump drew in a long, shaky breath. "You think you're so much better," he hissed, the microphone catching the tremor he couldn't disguise. "But when you've built something, anything, you'll see how hard it is to keep it from falling apart." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I have built something," she said, her voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean closer. "I've built trust. In communities you'd never dare to walk through without a camera crew. I've built coalitions among people you call disposable. I've built hope out of nothing." Traoré nodded slowly, his eyes locked on Trump. "And I have built a country's spine," he said. "Not perfect. But sovereign. You can't imagine what it feels like to have nothing handed to you and no one to kneel before." Trump's lip curled in a sneer, but Jasmine saw the panic rising behind it, like a dam about to crack under its own weight. "You talk about sovereignty and justice," Trump barked, "but you'll take American money when it suits you. You'll sit in our studios, use our platforms." "And tell the truth," Jasmine interjected, her tone calm as a blade. "Because your platforms don't belong to you anymore. They belong to the people watching, who are tired of being lied to." The moderator tried again, voice strained. "Congresswoman, Mr. President, I think it's time." "No," Jasmine said, never looking away from Trump. "It's time for the people who've never had a voice to hear this. To hear that power doesn't get to define reality unchallenged." A rustle swept across the audience as dozens of phones lifted into the air, recording, streaming, documenting. This was no longer just a debate. It was a reckoning. Trump looked at her, his eyes dark with something Jasmine recognized, something he'd never admit out loud. Not fear of her. Fear of irrelevance. Traoré folded his arms across his chest, his voice almost gentle. "You can call us ungrateful," he said. "But we are simply unafraid." Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "You call this the greatest country in the world," she said softly. "But greatness isn't measured by how long you can avoid accountability. It's measured by what you do when it finally arrives." Trump opened his mouth, but no words came. In that hush, Jasmine felt a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. She hadn't come here to humiliate him. She'd come to prove the empire was only ever as strong as people's willingness to look away. And today, nobody was looking away. The hush settled over the room like dust, coating every surface, every microphone, every camera lens. Jasmine could feel it pressing against her ribs, that electric stillness before a truth lands so hard it becomes irreversible. Trump sat back, but there was no victory in the motion, only retreat. She watched his hand curl loosely around the armrest, like a man who realized he could no longer command the story by raising his voice. "You think history will remember you kindly?" he demanded, but his tone had lost its edge. You think tearing me down will make you heroes? Jasmine's lips parted, not in a smile, but something sadder, something closer to pity. History doesn't care about your feelings, she said, her voice so steady it made the moment feel predestined. It cares about who told the truth when it was dangerous. Traoré spoke without shifting his gaze from Trump. And when it was your turn to be honest, you chose comfort. You chose myth. The moderator looked as if he might be sick. His fingers fluttered uselessly over his notes, searching for an escape clause that didn't exist. But the audience had stopped listening to him entirely. Trump shifted again, trying to recover the force that had carried him through 1,000 interviews, 1,000 stages. You can criticize all you want, he said, voice ragged. But I built something real. Jasmine leaned forward, cutting him off with nothing but her calm. Real, she repeated, the word echoing like a challenge. You built an empire of spectacle. Of headlines. Of fear. And the second someone refused to be intimidated, it started to crumble. She paused, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. But she knew she couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was this close to breaking free. You don't hate me because I oppose you, she continued, her tone dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried farther than any shout. You hate me because I'm not afraid of you. Because you know that once people see you clearly, they can't unsee it. Traoré nodded slowly, like a man watching the final piece fall into place. And they have seen you, he said. They have seen the hypocrisy. The cruelty. The hunger to be worshipped. Trump's gaze darted to the cameras, searching for someone, anyone, to salvage his dignity. But no one moved to help him. No producer called for a break. No sympathetic voice rose to rescue him. Jasmine felt her pulse slow, a strange calm filling her chest. This was why she'd come here. Not for applause. Not for revenge. But so that no one could ever again pretend they hadn't known. She turned to the audience, her voice soft but unshakable. If you take nothing else from this, remember, power is never permanent. Not when it feeds on lies. And in that moment, she saw the realization settle over Trump like a shadow he couldn't outrun. For a long time after she stopped speaking, nobody dared to break the silence. It spread across the studio like a tide, reaching the corners where the cameras had been set up, sweeping through the rows of reporters who'd come expecting a spectacle and were now witnessing something closer to an exorcism. Trump didn't look at her anymore. His gaze had drifted past her shoulder, as if he could pretend she wasn't there, pretend none of this was happening. But Jasmine knew he could still hear every word. Traoré sat beside her, hands folded, as unmovable as a mountain. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. History will not remember your slogans, he said, his accent softening the edges of the words. It will remember what you did, and what you refused to admit. The moderator swallowed, his throat working around words he couldn't seem to form. I think we should adjourn, he croaked finally. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She turned to face Trump one last time, her heart steady as iron. You built your empire on the conviction that nobody would dare to call you out, she said. That nobody would stand in your face and say, enough. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet was sharper than any shout. Well, she said, her eyes locked on his, we're saying it now. Trump's lips moved, but no sound came. It didn't matter. His silence was the only admission she needed. Jasmine looked out over the audience, past the cameras and the lights, to the people she knew were watching in living rooms and on subway platforms, on break at a night shift they never asked for. People who were tired of being told their lives were the collateral damage of someone else's ambition. This isn't about me, she said, her voice softer than it had been all night. And it isn't about him. It's about who gets to tell the story of this country. And I promise you. She paused, letting the hush swell around her like an anthem. It will not be the people who think power is a birthright. Traoré nodded once, as if sealing an unspoken pact between them. The cameras caught it, two leaders from different continents united by a single, unshakable truth: the era of unchallenged empires was ending. The moderator cleared his throat again, this time with the small, reverent quiet of a man who knew he'd just witnessed history. "Thank you," he whispered. We're adjourned." As the feed cut and the lights dimmed, Jasmine exhaled, her heart still thundering with the knowledge that something irreversible had happened. And she knew, so did everyone who had been watching. Because that night, when the headlines spread and the clips replayed in a million feeds, it wasn't Trump's face they shared. It was hers. You just watched what happens when power is finally forced to face the truth it has spent decades denying. This wasn't about cheap applause or political theater. This was about standing up in a room built to intimidate, and refusing to look away. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She did what so many are too afraid to do: she told the truth, plainly and without apology. And Traoré, he proved that courage isn't confined to any one country. It's universal. It's contagious. It's the spark that ignites when people decide they will no longer be silent. Tonight, an empire cracked because two voices refused to be quiet. And that matters, because it means you can do the same. If this story moved you, if it made you question the headlines or remember the power of your own voice, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself what lies you've been told and who benefits when you stay silent. Because when enough of us refuse to look away, even the biggest empire can't survive the light. Thank you for watching. And remember, this is just the beginning.